Prayer is the heartbeat of our relationship with God. It's in those quiet moments, whether early in the morning before the kids wake up, or after a long workday, that we pour out our hearts, seek His guidance, and find the strength to keep going. Yet, if we're honest, those moments are often under attack by distractions we don't even realize are there. For many of us, life is busier than ever. Maybe you're juggling work, kids' schedules, maintaining relationships, and church commitments. By the time you sit down to pray, your mind is already racing with everything that needs to get done. Or perhaps you've noticed that when you try to focus on God, a quick glance at your phone suddenly turns into 15 minutes of scrolling through emails, checking social media, or replying to a message. These distractions can feel small in the moment, but they are quietly sabotaging your prayer life, keeping you from the peace and connection with God that you desperately need. Let's be real. If you've ever felt like your prayer life is being hijacked by the busyness of life, technology, or your own racing thoughts, you're not alone. We've all been there and know what it's like to feel disconnected from God, wondering why prayer feels more like a struggle than a lifeline. But there's hope. You can reclaim that time and deepen your relationship with God, even in the midst of a hectic life. Distraction number 1: busyness and overcommitment. Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Matthew 11:28. We live in a culture that glorifies busyness, whether it's the demands of your job, your family, or even your involvement in church activities. It's easy to feel stretched thin. But Jesus' invitation in Matthew 11:28 calls us to find rest in Him. Instead of letting busyness dictate your life, God wants you to bring your burdens to Him so He can refresh your spirit. Often, we do let our schedules push God out of the picture. We say, "I'll pray later when things calm down," but somehow, later never comes. Instead of relying on God for strength and peace, we rely on our own energy and end up feeling more drained than ever. It's not uncommon for us to live the following scenario. You've just wrapped up a long day. You rushed out of the house in the morning, dropped the kids off at school, spent hours at work handling tasks and emails, and now you're home, trying to catch your breath. There's dinner to make, maybe some laundry to fold, and by the time everything is done, you just want to collapse into bed. You think about praying, but you're too tired, mentally drained, and the thought of having one more conversation, even with God, feels overwhelming. The next morning, it's the same thing all over again. The busyness of life has squeezed out your time with God. When we consistently allow busyness to crowd out our prayer time, we unknowingly communicate that God is an afterthought rather than our source of strength. Spiritually, this leads to burnout, frustration, and a feeling of disconnection from God. The more we rely on our own efforts, the more distant God feels. Jesus offers us rest, but that rest comes when we make time for Him, even when life is hectic. Prioritizing prayer doesn't mean everything else will fall apart. It means you'll face the rest of your day with more peace, focus, and grace. Maybe you're a working parent indeed, constantly balancing meetings and school drop-offs. Or perhaps you're single, managing a demanding job, friendships, and trying to stay involved at church. The pressure to be on all the time, always doing something productive, makes it hard to slow down and spend time with God. You might be thinking, "I don't have the luxury of extra time," but that's exactly the point. God is not asking for what's left over after the day is done. He's asking for your first moments, your best energy. And when you give Him that time, He promises to renew you. Imagine how different your day could feel if you started it with prayer instead of jumping straight into the chaos. You might find that when you place God first, the rest of your life falls into a healthier rhythm. Distraction number 2: technology and entertainment. Be still and know that I am God. Psalm 46:10. We live in a world that is constantly moving, where technology and entertainment are always within reach. While these can be useful tools, they often become distractions that prevent us from connecting with God. Psalm 46:10 reminds us of the importance of stillness. It's hard to hear God's voice in the middle of the noise we surround ourselves with. Technology itself isn't inherently bad, but when we allow it to consume the moments we could be spending in prayer, it takes our focus away from what matters most: our relationship with God. Think about those times when you've planned to spend quiet time with God, but you pick up your phone first. You just want to check one thing, but that quick glance turns into several minutes of scrolling. Before you know it, the time you had set aside for prayer is gone, replaced by social media updates or catching up on messages. It's easy to lose focus when technology is always competing for our attention. Consider what it would look like to set aside just 10 or 15 minutes a day without any digital distractions. No phone, no computer, just you and God. Making that intentional choice to disconnect could change how you experience prayer, bringing more focus and clarity into your spiritual life. The deeper issue isn't just the time we lose to technology, it's what we miss spiritually. Constant distraction keeps us from being fully present with God, and over time, it can weaken our connection to Him. When we fail to be still, as the Bible calls us to, we miss out on the peace and guidance that comes in moments of quiet reflection. Spiritually, making space for God in a world filled with distractions requires discipline. It's about more than just turning off our devices. It's about cultivating a heart that is sensitive to His presence. If we're always distracted, we won't be able to fully experience the depth of relationship that God desires for us. Distraction number 3, internal worries and fears. Do not be anxious about anything, but in everything by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. Philippians 4:6. Worries and fears are some of the most subtle yet powerful distractions. They don't need a screen or an external source to steal your focus. They come from within. Philippians 4:6 reminds us to bring our anxieties to God in prayer instead of letting them dominate our minds. But too often, rather than laying them at God's feet, we allow these worries to pull us away from Him. Anxiety can flood our thoughts, making it difficult to concentrate on prayer. We start with good intentions, but soon our minds wander back to the same cycle of concerns: work, finances, relationships, health. These distractions from within can be just as disruptive as those that come from outside. You've likely experienced this. You sit down to pray, but your thoughts are racing. You're trying to talk to God, but all you can think about are the bills that are due, the health concerns that linger, or the responsibilities waiting for you tomorrow. Instead of handing those worries to God, they take over, and soon your prayer time feels like an internal battle. One powerful step is learning to pause and refocus when those anxious thoughts creep in. Take a moment to breathe, acknowledge your worries, and intentionally give them over to God, trusting Him to handle what you cannot. Start by praying about the very thing that's distracting you. Once you do, you'll often find that the weight begins to lift. When we allow our worries to take over, we're essentially telling ourselves that our problems are too big for God to handle. This type of thinking leads to spiritual stagnation. Instead of growing in faith, we become trapped in a loop of fear and self-reliance, which ultimately keeps us from fully trusting God. Spiritually, this becomes an issue of surrender. The more we hold on to our worries, the less we allow God to work in those areas of our lives. But when we release those burdens to Him, we open ourselves up to His peace and provision. Choosing to pray through our anxieties rather than avoiding them is a step toward deeper trust and spiritual maturity. We've explored 3 common distractions that are sabotaging your prayer life: busyness, technology, and internal worries. Each one may seem small, but they all pull your attention away from the deeper connection with God that you're craving. Let me ask you, what's distracting you from experiencing God more fully in your prayer life? Is it the constant rush of daily life, the endless stream of notifications, or maybe it's your own anxious thoughts? Whatever it is, God is inviting you to lay it down and prioritize your time with Him. This week, I challenge you to take one step toward reclaiming your prayer life. Whether it's setting aside your phone, scheduling specific time for prayer, or choosing to trust God with your worries, make a conscious decision to be present with Him. You'll be amazed at the transformation that takes place when you put God first.